quiet scream no one heard echoed through the corridors of memory, buried beneath years of silence and betrayal. When a strange object is left behind, not by accident but by design, it begins a haunting ritual no one dares name. This is a tale of vanished honor, of wounds that refuse to heal, and of a past that refuses to stay buried. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a slate-grey morning in February that I found myself once again seated opposite my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, in the sitting room of our Baker Street lodgings. The fog, dense and yellowed with soot, pressed against the windows like a spectral curtain, rendering the world beyond vague and undefined. The fire crackled low in the grate, its warmth barely keeping the chill at bay. Holmes sat hunched in his chair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed as though in meditation. There was something peculiar about his stillness that morning, a sense of calculated dormancy, like a predator conserving its strength. I'd grown accustomed to his alternating bursts of frenetic activity and languid repose, yet this silence bore a different weight, as if he awaited the arrival of a puzzle not yet visible to the rest of us. Outside, the clip-clop of hooves and the hiss of carriage wheels upon wet stone played their eternal symphony. I turned a page of the Times, but my attention remained tethered to the man across from me. And when the bell downstairs rang at precisely 9:15, I felt, rather than heard, Holmes stir imperceptibly in his chair. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps preceded the hesitant knock at our door. At Holmes' murmured assent, the door creaked open to admit a gentleman of slight stature, his coat glistening with the morning's moisture, and a peculiar umbrella clutched in both hands as if it were a relic of fragile value. He removed his hat with a jerk and stood awkwardly in the entry, his eyes flitting between us like those of a man unsure whether he stood before judges or rescuers. "Mr. Holmes, I presume?" he inquired, his voice strained and uncertain. Holmes inclined his head but did not rise. "Indeed. And this is my friend and chronicler, Dr. Watson. Won't you step in from the fog, sir, and take a seat?" The man did so with some reluctance, his hands never straying far from the umbrella, which he rested upon his knees with the air of a man loath to part from a trusted companion. Holmes regarded the object with interest, his eyes flicking over the worn handle, the silk canopy, and a peculiar brass ferrule unlike any I had seen. "You appear troubled," Holmes observed gently. "Perhaps the weather is not the only storm you have braved this morning." The man blinked at Holmes's remark, visibly unsettled. "I beg your pardon, sir. How did you—" "My dear Mr. Larchmont," Holmes interrupted, leaning forward slightly, "your name is stitched, though faintly, upon the inner flap of your coat. A solicitor, I should think, though not in criminal matters. Your cuffs are ink-stained, but not your fingers. That umbrella, however, is of greater interest. May I?" Before our guest could answer, Holmes extended a hand with such natural authority that the man surrendered the item without protest. Holmes turned it slowly in his fingers. "This umbrella is 10 years old, yet it bears the hallmarks of recent use, re-waxed canopy, but an original handle. The ferrule is of a naval design, popular only in India, and there are faint traces of red dust along its edge, consistent with cornpoor clay. And yet," he added, tapping it lightly, "its owner wears no traces of travel, which tells me it is not yours." Larchmont's complexion paled. Holmes offered a thin smile. "You came to me not merely to inquire, but to confess, though you have not yet decided which." I did not know who else to turn to," Larchmont murmured. "It is not a crime, Mr. Holmes. Merely something I cannot explain." "Then perhaps," said Holmes, returning the umbrella, "it is something I can." Before Larchmont could elaborate, There came a sharp rap at the door, followed by the appearance of a uniformed messenger, rain still glistening on his shoulders. "Telegram for Mr. Holmes." Holmes accepted it without ceremony and unfolded the note. As his eyes scanned the page, his features sharpened with a sudden clarity I knew well, the look of a mind locking into its proper alignment. "A burglary last night," he said, almost to himself. "No valuables taken, only a single object removed, a portrait, and curiously, an umbrella left behind." He turned the telegram toward me. The address was that of a well-regarded solicitor, Mr. Percival Channing of Devonshire Place. Holmes rose and retrieved his coat. "Come, Watson, it would appear that umbrellas, like crimes, are not always what they seem." And thus, with scarcely a backward glance at our bewildered visitor, we stepped once more into the fog, pursuing not a man, but a question. Scarcely had we descended the front steps of Devonshire Place when we were met with a telegram from Mr. Percival Channing, a solicitor of reputable standing in the Temple. The message, couched in restrained yet urgent terms, requested a private audience at his earliest possible convenience. By the time we returned to Baker Street, he was already awaiting us, pacing nervously by the hearth, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He was a man of some 40 years, with a narrow face, prematurely silvered temples, and that carefully cultivated appearance one often observes among members of the legal profession. Composed without being warm, exact without being open. Yet it was his eyes, restless and rimmed with sleeplessness, that betrayed a deeper current. "My apologies for the unannounced intrusion, Mr. Holmes," he said upon our entry, inclining his head with stiff politeness. "But I find myself quite at a loss. A most peculiar event has taken place at my home, and I am uncertain whether I require the services of a detective or a doctor." "You shall have both," Holmes replied smoothly, gesturing toward me. "Pray be seated, Mr. Channing. The peculiar is our province. Now tell us, what has disturbed your peace?" Mr. Channing seated himself with an air of forced composure, though his gloved fingers betrayed him by fidgeting with the brim of his hat. "There was a break-in last night at my residence," he began. "Sometime between the hours of 11 and 3, as far as I can determine. My wife and I had retired early, she having been unwell for several days, and I did not discover the disturbance until morning." "Was the house ransacked?" I inquired. "No," he replied with a faint shake of the head. "That is what strikes me as so confounding. Nothing of value was taken. The silver, the cash box, the clock on the mantelpiece, all untouched." Holmes leaned back slightly. "And yet you are here." Channing hesitated. "One item was taken, a portrait. A rather old one, tucked away in the study, of no value to anyone, I should think. It depicts my elder brother Edward." "Ah," said Holmes, "a man presumably deceased." "Presumed, yes," said Channing. "He was lost at sea some 10 years ago. His vessel, an independent cargo steamer, was wrecked off the southern coast of Portugal. No bodies were recovered." "Curious," murmured Holmes. "So the thief ignored gold and took a ghost instead." Channing looked momentarily startled. "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing," Holmes said lightly. "Go on." "There is one other detail, Mr. Holmes," the solicitor added quietly. "Something I cannot explain, and which has unsettled my wife terribly." Channing leaned forward, lowering his voice instinctively as if the walls might overhear. "An umbrella," he said. "It was left behind in the study." "Your own, I presume?" I asked. He shook his head. "That is the strange part. It is not mine, nor does it belong to anyone in the household." Holmes's eyes lit with interest. "Describe it." "Black silk, rather worn. The handle is of dark wood, curved. I noted a brass ferrule, tarnished but intact. There's a faded ribbon tied near the base as if it once served as a token." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And where was it discovered?" leaning against the wall beneath the place where the portrait once hung. Was it wet? Dry, Channing replied, though there had been rain the evening before. Holmes nodded slowly. So it was not used in a rival. Perhaps it was never meant to serve as shelter at all. Channing said nothing, but his unease seemed to deepen. Holmes tapped a finger thoughtfully against the arm of his chair. Mr. Channing, umbrellas have their uses beyond the repelling of rain. Sometimes they shield secrets far older than the storm. There was a silence. The solicitor shifted uncomfortably, and I could see that Holmes had struck a nerve. Holmes rose and crossed to the hearth, where he stood gazing into the low flames. "Tell me, Mr. Channing," he said without turning, "was your brother a man given to sentiment?" Channing's pause was telling. In his youth, perhaps, less so in later years. "And this portrait, why keep it?" The solicitor inhaled slowly. "It was a matter of family, I suppose. Edward and I were not close, but he was my blood. After his death, it seemed wrong to dispose of it." "A quiet guilt," Holmes murmured. "And yet you did not display the portrait prominently." "No," Channing admitted. "It was in my study, behind a cabinet. My wife always found it unsettling." Holmes turned, his gaze sharp. "And why was that?" Channing hesitated. "She knew him, briefly, before we were married." "Indeed," said Holmes. "And how well did you know him, Mr. Channing?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Channing's face, already pale, grew visibly strained. "Well enough," he said at last, "though I suspect I never knew him as others did." Holmes gave a soft, unreadable smile. "Then perhaps it is Edward we must now come to know, if only through the eyes of a thief." He glanced toward me. "Watson, take note." After Channing had departed, Holmes stood for some time by the window, gazing absently into the street below. The fog had thickened, and the lamplighters were making their rounds, halos of gold blooming in the damp air. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "what do you make of our Mr. Channing?" I offered a tentative summary, nervous, proud, and clearly withholding information. "Quite so," Holmes replied. "He sits atop a nest of contradictions. A missing portrait, a mislaid umbrella, a brother presumed dead, yet treated as if still present, and all bound together by a wife who trembles at shadows. You believe the brother lives?" "I believe," Holmes said quietly, "that someone wishes us to believe something. Whether it is truth or illusion remains to be seen." He turned back to the fire, eyes glinting. "One thing is certain. We are not being told everything. And when truth hides, Watson, it does so with purpose." The air had thickened by the time Holmes and I set out for the Channing residence that afternoon, the fog settling over the city like a weary curtain. Holmes walked briskly, his eyes cast downward and his brows drawn together in that singular expression which in him denoted not worry, but mental calculation. I had grown accustomed to such silences and did not intrude upon it, content instead to observe the rhythm of his gait and the unusual solemnity that seemed to cling to him. He spoke only once as we crossed Cavendish Square. "It is not the theft that concerns me, Watson, but the purpose behind it. Portraits are not taken by thieves, they are taken by the haunted." I turned to him, but he had already quickened his step, and I followed in silence, wondering, as I often did, what darkness Holmes had already glimpsed where I had seen only shadow. The Channing residence stood in respectable modesty behind a trim hedge and a black iron gate, its appearance giving no outward hint of recent disturbance. We were admitted by a housemaid of nervous disposition who informed us that Mr. Channing was presently at his chambers, but that Mrs. Channing awaited us in the drawing-room. Holmes requested instead to be shown directly to the study, and the maid, though hesitant, obliged. The study was a square chamber of fair proportion, lined with shelves of legal volumes and ledgers. A writing desk occupied the centre, and a large leather armchair sat angled before the hearth. Yet it was not the furnishing that drew Holmes's attention. His eyes swept the room once, then again, this time narrowing upon specific details. "Observe, Watson," he said, gesturing with his cane. "There, beneath the rug, a scorch mark, slight but definite, not the kind left by pipe ash, but a broader smudge, perhaps from a lantern knocked askew." He moved to the far wall. "And here, note the faint outline of a frame, now absent, and a shallow scratch in the wood just below." Holmes bent, his nostrils flaring slightly. "And do you detect that? A faint odour, clove and musk, overlaid with salt. Not a London scent. Tobacco, certainly, but of a kind not native to English soil." He straightened, eyes alight. "This was no casual intrusion, Watson. It was deliberate, calculated. The man knew what he sought, and he left behind more than he took." The umbrella, of course, stood waiting by the fireplace, like a guest forgotten, or a message not yet read. Mrs. Channing entered a moment later, a slender woman of perhaps 35 years, with auburn hair pulled back in careful elegance, and a complexion paled either by worry or illness. She greeted us with polite reserve, yet I detected a certain guardedness behind her civility, a manner of speaking that placed each word like a stone in water, testing for depth. "I trust Mr. Channing explained the circumstances?" she inquired, seating herself opposite us. "Only briefly," Holmes replied. "We found the study most instructive." Her eyes flickered briefly toward the fireplace, where the umbrella rested. If she noticed it, she gave no indication. "You were at home during the incident, madam?" "I was," she said, "though I heard nothing. I suffer from restless nights and had taken laudanum for sleep." Holmes inclined his head. "And your familiarity with the missing portrait?" Her gaze darkened. "It belonged to my husband's brother, a man I knew before my marriage. I found it unsettling to keep his likeness." "Because of what he represented," Holmes said softly. She did not answer, but her silence spoke volumes. I noted then the faint trembling of her hands, and knew that fear had visited this house long before the thief ever did. Holmes crossed once more to the umbrella and lifted it with care, turning it over in his long fingers, as though examining a specimen beneath a glass. "You are certain," he asked Mrs. Channing, "that this umbrella does not belong to your household?" "Quite certain," she replied. "It is neither my husband's nor the servant's." Holmes nodded. "Then its presence is most telling." He tilted the handle toward me. "Notice, Watson, the wear pattern on the grip. Right-handed use, frequent. And here, along the ferrule, a trace of what appears to be sea salt crust. The fabric has been rewaxed, but not professionally. This is a personal object, one kept in use out of habit rather than care." He paused, then spoke with quiet certainty. "It was not left in haste. It was planted, deliberately, and with intent." Mrs. Channing drew a sharp breath, but Holmes pressed no further. "To leave behind a trace is careless," he continued. "But to leave behind a symbol, that is something else entirely. We must ask ourselves not what was forgotten, but what was meant to be found." He lowered the umbrella slowly, as though setting aside a clue not yet ripe enough to be plucked. Holmes moved once more to the writing desk, where he stooped with sudden interest over the hearth's stone lip. With a pair of tweezers, he retrieved a fragment of ash, dark, fine, and oddly aromatic. "Tobacco," he murmured, "but not of the English variety. Note the texture, lighter than shag, and mixed with crushed leaf." He held it briefly beneath his nose. "Clove, yes, and a hint of sandalwood. This is Burmese in origin, or possibly Siamese, but not something one would find in a gentleman's pipe on Fleet Street." I peered closer. "You believe it belongs to the intruder?" "Almost certainly," Holmes replied. "And if we are fortunate, The source will be traceable. Imports of such blends are rare and usually confined to certain sailors' tobacconists along the docks. He placed the ash in a paper envelope, sealing it with care. Sometimes, he said with a faint smile, the smallest remnants carry the heaviest truths. That evening, we descended toward the darker quarters of the city, where the lamps burned low and the air was tinged with salt and soot. Holmes led me to a cramped tobacconist's shop, nestled between a pawnbroker and a fishmonger, a place I would have passed 1,000 times without notice. The proprietor, a man with a Turkish fez and a cloud of pipe smoke perpetually wreathing his head, regarded Holmes with a wary familiarity. "You're looking for something rare," he said before Holmes had spoken a word. Holmes inclined his head. "A blend, imported only in small quantities. Burmese origin, clove forward, notes of sandalwood, smoked by someone. Recently returned." The man nodded. "Had a shipment last month, just a handful of buyers, all Navy men. One of them, tall fellow, scar on his temple. Paid cash, no name." "Did he mention a brother?" Holmes asked softly. "Number?" "But he bought a pipe too, ivory. Said he liked old things." Holmes thanked him and stepped back into the night, the wind curling around his coat. "A man buying the past," he said, more to himself than to me. "But men rarely smoke memory unless they fear forgetting." Our final visit of the evening took us to a seedy waterfront tavern, where Holmes exchanged a sovereign for a quiet word with a retired sailor nursing rum at the end of the bar. The man squinted at the description and nodded slowly. "Aye, that'd be him. Came round last week asking after Macready's widow. Said he served with us off Goa. Weren't no ghost neither, flesh and blood. But there's something wrong in his head, you mark me." "His name?" Holmes asked. "Didn't give it. But he had the eyes of a man who's been lost too long. Called himself Ned." Holmes's lips tightened. As we departed, he turned to me. "Ned," he said. "Short for Edward." "You believe it's him?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that the dead have a strange habit of returning when memory is disturbed." The next morning brought confirmation from Scotland Yard. Holmes and I met with Inspector Lestrade, who had pulled the records of several unresolved break-ins from recent months. "Same story," Lestrade muttered, sliding a file across the table. "No valuables taken, a single object removed, a locket in one case, a medal in another, and always the same thing left behind." He pointed to a photograph. "An umbrella, same model, same brass ferrule." Holmes examined the image. "And the victims?" "Naval connections, all of them. Retired officers or widows of men lost at sea." Holmes gave a slight nod. "The pattern is no longer accidental." Lestrade frowned. "You think it's one man?" "I think," Holmes said coldly, "that it is one memory. And memory, Lestrade, makes a poor thief, but an excellent ghost." That evening we sat once again in our Baker Street rooms, the fire casting shadows across the walls, as Holmes paced the carpet with folded arms. "It is not theft," he said at last. "It is ritual." I looked up. "Ritual? Yes, Watson. Each object removed is tied to the past. Each umbrella left behind is not a mistake, but a cipher, a pattern meant not for us, but for one man." "Channing." Holmes shook his head. "Not yet, but soon." He paused, then turned toward me, eyes glinting with quiet certainty. "This is no thief's folly. It is the architecture of memory, carefully arranged, maddeningly precise. We are not chasing a criminal. We are chasing the shape of regret." And as he reached for his violin, I saw that rarest of things in Sherlock Holmes, not excitement, but gravity. Something deeper than deduction stirred beneath his composure. It was on the following morning that Holmes sent word for me to accompany him to the Admiralty Records Office, where he had secured temporary access to certain naval registries. The clerk, a man of middling age and suspicious temperament, was eventually persuaded by Holmes's letter of introduction and ushered us into a dusty room lined with steel cabinets and the scent of mothballs and ink. Holmes wasted no time. He drew forth the service record of Lieutenant Edward Channing with all the ceremony of a coroner unveiling a corpse. "Note," he said, pointing to the crisp entry near the end, "that the discharge was not due to injury, as Percival implied." I read the notation aloud. "Dishonourable discharge. Conduct unbecoming of an officer. July 1877. Holmes flipped the page. And here, court-martialed for smuggling contraband aboard a naval cargo ship. He evaded full punishment by resigning his commission and promptly vanished. 2 months later, a report of his presumed death in a shipping accident off the Portuguese coast. I stared at the page, feeling as if a draft had passed through the room. "You think he faked his death?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that Edward Channing was not buried at sea, but beneath a story, one that his brother helped author." The thought unsettled me. A dead man returned was strange enough. A disgraced one, cloaked in silence by his own kin, was something far darker. And Holmes, I could see, had already begun peeling away the final veil. Upon our return to Baker Street, Holmes drew forth a slim brown ledger he had earlier borrowed from a discreet associate in banking. He opened it on the table with reverence, as one might an ancient text, and began to trace the entries with his index finger. "These are recent withdrawals made under the name E. Channing," he said. "Small amounts, always in cash, regular intervals, and from branches with no fixed address, travelling banks, some even aboard moored ships." I leaned closer. "You believe it is him?" "I do," Holmes said. "Observe the handwriting. Here and here, it matches the naval registration from the service file." "But wouldn't the authorities have noted this anomaly?" "Not necessarily. A presumed dead man reappearing as a modest pensioner does not raise flags, particularly if he avoids London's centre and drifts along its edges." He moved to another sheet. "Now consider these pawn receipts, items deposited under the initials NC. Yet each one matches the inventory of Edward's recorded possessions: a naval sextant, an ivory-handled razor, a cufflink engraved with the family crest." "Why the change in initials?" I asked. "Because Ned Channing is easier to forget than Edward Channing. But the hand that pawned these relics remembers too much." I saw then that Holmes's gaze was not on the page, but beyond it, as if he were already seeing the man who walked in Edward's shadow. "We are not following footsteps," he said, "but memories that leave marks where feet never tread." That very afternoon, Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, his expression a blend of irritation and intrigue, a combination I had come to associate with any case in which Holmes had outpaced him by several steps. "There's been another incident," he said, declining tea and removing his gloves. "Similar to the Channing affair. A break-in at the home of one Captain Elias Stone, retired, served aboard the HMS Orpheus." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Edward Channing was listed among her crew." Lestrade nodded. "Nothing stolen, again, except this time a single item was displaced. A logbook from the captain's desk. Not removed, mind you, just shifted. And of course," he reached into his satchel and produced a black umbrella. I recognized it instantly. Brass ferrule, worn handle, a sibling to the one found in the Channing study. Holmes took it gently, studying its weight. "He's repeating a pattern," he murmured. "These are not acts of burglary. They are performances, each one staged with precision." Lestrade snorted. "If it's theatre, then what's the part of the umbrella?" Holmes gave a half smile. "A signature, a calling card, or perhaps a confession." He turned toward the fire, the umbrella held lightly in his fingers. "2 umbrellas," he said quietly. "2 memories disturbed. And somewhere, a man who believes he has not yet finished rewriting the past." That evening found Holmes more reticent than usual. He stood long at the window, violin untouched, his silhouette stark against the pane as gaslight flickered beneath the fog. I ventured a remark, something about the umbrellas, the symbols, the strange logic of it all, but he did not respond at once. When he did speak, it was in a tone I seldom heard from him, one not of certainty, but of meditation. "It is not theft, Watson," he said, "nor revenge in the conventional sense. It is memory, ritualized, reconstructed, relived, like the echo of a sin that refuses to fade." "You mean he is mad?" "Not mad," Holmes replied, "but unraveling. Grief can harden into ritual, especially when guilt runs deep." He turned at last, his face illuminated not by triumph, but by something more somber. "I have met murderers without remorse, thieves without desperation, but the most dangerous men I've known are those who believe they are rewriting history. They do not seek forgiveness, Watson. They seek restoration." "And Edward Channing?" "Seeks to haunt the living," Holmes whispered, "because the dead no longer answer." He returned to his chair and fell silent, lost, I believe, not in logic, but in memory of his own. It was near midnight when Holmes summoned me back to the sitting room. Upon the table, beneath the lamp, lay both umbrellas, the one from Channing's study and the other retrieved from Captain Stone's home. "You see it now, do you not?" he asked, gesturing toward the handles. I stepped closer and peered more intently. At first glance, they appeared identical in wear and design. But as Holmes rotated them, I saw it. A faint notch carved near the base of each grip, imperceptible unless one looked for it. "A marking?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "More than that. A code he withdrew a naval semaphore chart and laid it beside the umbrellas. These marks correspond with flag signals, specifically, a message once used in naval dispatches. This one," he said, pointing, "translates to the word house, and this, indicating the other, to the numbers 1877. "The year of his discharge," I murmured. "Indeed. These umbrellas are not mementos. They are messages." He looked up at me, the firelight glinting in his eyes. "Edward Channing is not merely returning to places he knew. He is recreating them, each act a piece of the same unsent letter. And somewhere at its end lies a recipient who has yet to open it." Holmes leaned back in his chair. "This is no longer a matter of deduction," he said. "It is a matter of decoding grief itself." It was not long after dusk when we received the urgent summons. A servant from the Channing household, breathless and wide-eyed, arrived at Baker Street, stammering of an attack in the garden and begging Mr. Holmes to come at once. We wasted no time. The fog hung low as we arrived, the lamps along the gate burning dim against the descending dark. In the back garden, beneath the skeletal branches of wintered shrubs, Mrs. Channing stood surrounded by a knot of staff, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders and her face drained of all colour. Holmes moved to her side without hesitation. "Are you injured?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "Number he. He did not touch me. He only stood there. And then he ran." Holmes's voice, always steady, grew quieter. "What did he look like?" "I could not see his face, but he wore a naval coat, long, dark, with brass buttons, and he said my name." At that she shivered, not from cold, but from something older, something rooted in memory. Holmes nodded slowly. "Where did he go?" "Over the wall," a gardener answered. "Quick as a fox, gone before we reached her." Holmes stepped back, his gaze sweeping the perimeter, and I knew, as did he, that the spectre of Edward Channing had now cast off illusion and taken form. Holmes made a swift circuit of the garden, crouching at intervals to inspect the gravel path and the dew-darkened grass. I followed at a respectful distance, knowing better than to disturb him during such examinations. At length, he paused near the boundary wall where a broken flower pot lay tipped upon its side. "Here," he said, pointing to a faint indentation in the soil, half a footprint, incomplete, but still discernible. "A size 10, military issue. The tread is consistent with boots issued prior to 1878, naval pattern." He stood and examined the jagged edge of a bramble bush nearby. Caught among its thorns was a single thread of dark blue wool. "A torn cuff," he said, with the stiffness of a brass button still present in the weave. He was in a hurry. "And yet," I murmured. He paused long enough to speak her name. Holmes nodded. Because that was the purpose of his visit, not violence, but memory. He turned and looked back toward the house, where Mrs. Channing had been led inside. He wanted to be seen, Watson. Or perhaps he wanted to see how he would be remembered. The shadows lengthened around us, but I felt then a colder darkness settling over the case. When we entered the drawing room a few minutes later, we found Mrs. Channing seated near the hearth, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Though her composure had returned in part, there remained a tension about her that no warmth could ease. Holmes approached her slowly, not as a detective, but almost as a physician might approach a patient one fears is concealing a wound. "I must ask, madam," he said with gentle solemnity, "whether there is more to your connection with Edward Channing than you have disclosed." She looked up sharply but said nothing. Her right hand trembled slightly as she lifted the cup to her lips. It was then that Holmes's eyes narrowed with surgical precision. "You are wearing gloves indoors," he said, "despite the warmth of the fire." I was cold," she replied. "Permit me then," Holmes said, "to observe the nature of your chill." With an unreadable expression, she removed the right glove. Upon the inner wrist, half concealed by lace, was a faded mark, an anchor entwined with ivy, the ink long blurred, but unmistakable in design. "A sailor's emblem," Holmes said, "but not your own." She did not speak, but I saw tears welling in her eyes. Holmes bowed his head slightly. "Thank you. That will be all, for now." Mrs. Channing did not attempt to deny what the tattoo had already revealed. Instead, she sat in silence for a long moment, gathering herself before she spoke. "I was scarcely 20 when I met Edward," she said softly. "He was wild, yes, but full of dreams, reckless, brilliant, and utterly captivating." She looked into the fire. "He was not the man his brother believed him to be. Or perhaps he was, and I loved him anyway." "What happened?" I asked gently. "He vanished," she said. "No letter, no word, only the news that his ship had gone down. I mourned him in silence, and when Percival proposed, I accepted. I thought it was the sensible path." She paused. "I burned the letters. I put away the memories, but the portrait, when it came into this house, I could not look at it. It was not guilt, it was grief, carved into something permanent." Holmes's voice was low. "And now," she turned toward him, "now, I feel as though the grave has given up something that ought to have stayed buried." Holmes did not reply, but his expression, often so coldly rational, bore in that moment something close to pity. When we departed the Channing residence that night, the fog clung to the gas lamps like gauze. Holmes walked in silence for some time, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "It is no longer a matter of stolen objects, Watson," he said at last. "This is a story of memory, of a man erased, a woman who remembers, and a brother who chose silence over scandal." "You believe Percival betrayed Edward?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that Edward believes so." And belief, especially when nourished by isolation and disgrace, becomes a dangerous thing. He stopped beneath a flickering lamppost and turned to me. 3 lives, he said, each tethered to the same history, but pulling in opposite directions. That, Watson, is not a case. It is a fracture, and somewhere within it, the man in the naval coat walks like a splinter beneath the skin. He resumed walking. And splinters, I fear, never stay buried. The following morning found Holmes in one of his rare but unmistakable moods of decision, an energy not of haste, but of clarity sharpened to a razor's edge. He stood at the centre of our sitting room, fingers steepled beneath his chin, as I read aloud the morning's telegrams. "Watson," he said at length, "the time has come to break the illusion." "You believe he'll return again?" "I believe," he replied, "that he must." A ritual unfulfilled exerts its own gravitational pull upon the mind that conceived it. Edward Channing is not merely revisiting his past, he is attempting to perfect it. But one misstep in his pattern, one small contradiction, and the entire fiction will crack. He moved to the writing desk and uncapped his pen. We must give him that contradiction. A third umbrella, out of place, out of time. You intend to bait him. Holmes looked up with a grim smile. No, Watson, I intend to summon him. I watched as he began to write, one letter to Mr. Channing, another to Inspector Lestrade, and I understood, with a small chill, that Holmes was not merely setting a trap for a criminal, he was calling a ghost back to the scene of his own unfinished story. By late afternoon, our plans were firmly in motion. Holmes had arranged for a modest gathering at the Channing residence under the pretext of reviewing certain inconsistencies in the initial investigation. Mr. Channing was instructed to be present, along with Lestrade, who had grown increasingly sceptical of Holmes's insistence upon psychological nuance in a case that lacked tangible theft. "Insist upon punctuality," Holmes told the inspector curtly. "Time in this matter is not merely procedural, it is symbolic." Lestrade, though grumbling, complied. We arrived at the house just as the lamps were being lit. The staff had been instructed to retire early, and the rear door was left unlatched, per Holmes's quiet direction. Mr. Channing seemed uneasy, his eyes darting often toward the study, where Holmes had spent the better part of the hour arranging the room with a precision that seemed both theatrical and clinical. And at the heart of it, leaning silently by the hearth, stood the third umbrella. Holmes placed the third umbrella in the exact position where the first had once rested, tilted slightly against the baseboard, its brass ferrule just touching the edge of the rug. It was nearly identical to the others. Black silk canopy, curved dark wood handle, and, most crucially, the faint notch carved just beneath the grip. "A forgery," I whispered, marvelling at the detail. "A mirror," Holmes corrected, "but one that reflects a future the intruder did not author. That is the flaw. Won't he recognize the deception? If his mind were wholly intact, yes. But obsession has a way of blinding even the most calculating man. He will see only that something is out of place, and he will act not to steal, but to restore the illusion." Holmes stood then, surveying the room as an architect might his blueprints. "The ritual must continue," he said, almost to himself, "and we shall interrupt it mid-performance." He extinguished the lamps, save for one, which cast a long shadow across the umbrella. Then, with Lestrade concealed near the garden entrance, and Holmes and I positioned in silence behind the curtain, we waited, not for a thief, but for a man attempting to rewrite a single chapter of his life with one final act. The house had long since gone still when I first heard it. The faint creak of a floorboard, followed by the soft scuff of a boot sole against polished wood. Holmes's hand touched my arm briefly in warning, his entire form suddenly alert, yet immobile. Through the narrow opening in the curtain, I watched as a figure emerged from the darkness of the hall. He moved with remarkable silence, as though he had traversed these rooms 1,000 times in his memory. The man paused by the study door. In the gaslight's faint gleam, I could make out the long coat, the sunken posture, and the unmistakable curve of naval shoulders. He moved toward the hearth, his steps deliberate, reverent, and reached for the umbrella. But his hand stopped short. He studied it. A long, suspended breath followed. Then, with a suddenness that startled even me, he lifted it with both hands and turned to leave. It was then that Holmes stepped forward and spoke a single word. "Edward." The figure froze, and Lestrade stepped from the shadows behind him. There was no struggle, only a long sigh, as though the performance, at last, had met its final curtain. He stood motionless as Lestrade moved in to secure him, making no attempt at resistance. When Holmes turned up the lamp, I beheld the full features of the man who had been a name, a portrait, a ghost. Edward Channing's face was hollowed by time, his jaw lined with scar tissue, his left cheek marred by what appeared to be a long-healed burn. But it was his eyes that arrested me, not wild or vacant, as I had feared, but steady, unnervingly steady. "I knew," he said at last, his voice hoarse from disuse, "the moment I saw it. That umbrella, she never would have let me use that ribbon." Holmes inclined his head. "You remember her well." Edward's gaze did not waver. "I remember everything. That was the problem." Lestrade began to speak, some procedural formality, but Holmes silenced him with a gesture. "Let him speak." Edward looked down at the umbrella in his hands. "I only wanted to undo it, to take back what they buried me with. Every home I entered was a page turned backward." He turned to Holmes. "And this one, this was the last." There was no bitterness in his tone, only exhaustion, like a man who had finally reached the end of his own remembering. Later, as we sat once more in the drawing room, Holmes offered his final explanation, not for Lestrade's benefit, but, I believe, for mine. "Edward Channing did not return to reclaim valuables," he began. "He returned to complete a narrative, one interrupted by disgrace, betrayal, and silence." "The umbrellas," I said. "Each a message." Holmes nodded. "Yes. Each one carved with a symbol, each placed with precision. They were tokens, yes, but not of warning, of presence, of reclamation." He gestured toward the one recovered that night. "The third umbrella, which we planted, bore an error. The ribbon, an addition not of memory, but of assumption. That was what broke the illusion for him." Lestrade frowned. "So, you believe all of this, breaking into homes, taking portraits, leaving umbrellas, it was all a kind of performance?" "Not performance," Holmes corrected gently. "Reenactment. Each act corresponded to a memory he could not relinquish. A locket, a letter, a gesture left unfinished. He sought not vengeance, but revision." "And Percival?" I asked. Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "He silenced a brother to preserve a name. Edward's punishment was obscurity, his ritual, an attempt to claw back into the narrative he'd been written out of." Holmes leaned back, folding his hands. "It is a dangerous thing, Watson, to rob a man not of life, but of meaning. He will seek it again, somewhere, somehow, even if he must leave behind umbrellas to mark the pages." It was a strange and solemn tableau that unfolded in the drawing room of the Channing residence that morning. Mr. Percival Channing stood stiffly by the window, his features composed but pale. To his right sat Holmes, ever watchful, and beside him Inspector Lestrade, whose manner bore a hint of unease uncommon even for him. And then, into that carefully arranged room, Edward Channing was brought. He entered not with the defiance of a man in chains, but with the slow, inward bearing of one who had already borne the heavier burden of memory. His coat was worn, his hair streaked with grey, and his eyes, those eyes, fixed upon his brother with a gaze so level and unreadable that for a moment no one spoke. Percival was the first to break. "Edward," he said, scarcely above a whisper. Edward did not reply. He took one step forward. "I came here," he said quietly, "to look you in the face. After all this time, after the silence. You should not have come at all." Holmes intervened gently. "Gentlemen, this is not a trial, but it may yet be a reckoning." The tension in the room thickened, not with fear, but with the weight of what had gone unspoken for far too long. Edward's voice, when he next spoke, held neither fury nor grief. It was flat, quietly accusatory, like an indictment chiselled from stone. "You gave them my name," he said, "the officers, the court, the board of inquiry. It was your hand behind the letter." Percival's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. "I knew it even then," Edward continued, "but I wanted to believe it was someone else. A jealous subordinate, a slighted officer, not my own brother." Holmes's eyes flicked to Percival, whose composure had begun to erode. Lestrade leaned forward slightly, frowning. "I had to," Percival said at last. "They would have come for me next. My future, my practice, our family name, it would all have unravelled." Edward's hands clenched into fists. "So you chose silence. You let me drown, not in the sea, but in dishonour, and then you buried me with a lie." "I was trying to preserve what I could," Percival said, his voice growing brittle. "You had already destroyed everything else." Lestrade looked toward Holmes, but Holmes did not move. He allowed the moment to unfold as it must. For this was no longer merely a matter of law, it was the bleeding core of the case, at last laid bare. There was a long pause, during which Percival Channing seemed to shrink, not physically but inwardly, as though a lifetime of composure had cracked beneath the weight of his brother's gaze. "Yes," he said finally, "I did it." He did not lift his eyes. "I sent the letter. I thought it would be quiet, that it would remain anonymous. But when the charges came, when the discharge followed, by then it was too late." He turned, this time not to Edward, but to Holmes. "You must understand. I was young, ambitious. Our family's standing was fragile. One scandal would have ruined us both." "You preserved your name," Edward said, "and left mine to rot." Percival's voice faltered. "I didn't know you would vanish, that you would never come back." "I didn't vanish," Edward replied. "I was erased." At that, Percival sat heavily in his chair. His hands trembled slightly, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked not like a solicitor, nor a man of society, but a brother confronting the cost of his own silence. Holmes gave no nod, no remark. He simply folded his hands together and let the ruin settle in the stillness. It was I who asked the next question, though I did not plan it. "And the portrait?" I said quietly. "Why take it?" Edward turned to me, the faintest trace of fatigue in his expression. "Because it was the only thing left of me in this house. Hung not out of honour, but out of guilt. A portrait left to wither behind a cabinet, like a secret no one wanted to burn." He looked toward Percival. "So I took it, not out of vengeance, but to reclaim it. If I was to be erased, then let it be completely. Not a reminder in a hallway, not a face behind a closed door." Holmes murmured, "Erasure as an act of control." Edward nodded. "It was the only part of the narrative that belonged to me." There was a silence after that, not empty but heavy, and in it, I understood the portrait had never been about likeness, but about presence. Holmes, who had until then remained largely quiet, now leaned forward and addressed both brothers with a soft certainty. "The umbrellas," he said, "were not merely symbols. They were your language, were they not? Edward gave the barest of nods. Naval semaphore, Holmes continued. Subtle carvings, left in each handle. Messages only the two of you would understand. A silent dialogue. Percival glanced up, startled. You knew? I suspected. Each umbrella corresponded to a date or location of past injury. A message, not to the world, but to you. Edward added, I wasn't asking for forgiveness. I was asking to be seen. Percival said nothing. Holmes sat back. You spoke in the only language your brother had not forgotten, and the only one he could not ignore. And then he said no more. For the rest, Holmes understood, had to be said between brothers alone. With the facts established and emotions laid bare, the legal question remained. Lestrade, though reluctant, yielded to Holmes's quiet counsel. He is not a criminal, Holmes said. He is a man fractured by silence and memory. And so it was arranged that Edward Channing would not face prison, but be committed to a quiet sanatorium in Surrey. A place where, as Holmes later said, memory could unfold without malice, and the past might soften its grip. As Edward was led away, he did not look back, but something in his bearing had changed. A performance completed, a curtain fallen, and perhaps, at last, a piece begun. We returned to Baker Street in the small hours, the city lying hushed beneath a misty veil, as if London herself had drawn a breath and held it. Holmes said little on the cab ride, and I, knowing his habits too well, respected the silence that so often preceded the flowering of explanation. At last, in the warmth of our sitting room, I took my usual chair beside the fire. The gas lamp flickered gently over the shelves of books and case files that had borne witness to so many solved enigmas. Holmes, having removed his coat and gloves, lit a fresh pipe and stood in contemplation by the window. I suppose, I said after a time, that it is now that I am to be enlightened. Holmes turned slowly, his expression composed, but faintly wearied. Yes, Watson. Now that the shadows have been confronted, let us attend to their shapes. Holmes retrieved a small leather notebook from the mantel and took a seat opposite me. There were 3 umbrellas, he began, and like any triad, their order reveals a structure. I leaned forward, already sensing the familiar pleasure of clarity unfolding. The first, he said, was Edward's original, carried with him during his earlier life, marked not only by time and use, but by a private symbol, naval semaphore etched subtly into the handle. It was this object that linked him to his brother's household, left not by mistake, but by design. A reintroduction, I nodded. And the second, Holmes continued, was a decoy, planted at the home of a fellow naval officer, a place of past significance. It bore similar markings, but with an altered message. This was not to draw attention, but to reinforce a narrative, a pattern meant for a single recipient. It was part of the ritual, part of the message. And the third, I asked. He gave a rare smile. The third was ours, of course. The bait, planted with subtle imperfection, a ribbon he would not have used, a placement inconsistent with his previous method. That contradiction pierced the veil. He returned not to steal, but to correct. I sat back, the pattern now fully formed. He was not trying to mislead, I said. He was trying to be understood. Precisely, Holmes replied. And we, for once, had to listen, not to lies, but to longing. Holmes stood and crossed to his desk, where he retrieved 2 of the umbrellas, now carefully labelled and wrapped in muslin. With delicate hands, he untied the covering and laid one before me. Observe this notch, Watson, he said, indicating the underside of the handle. And this, 3 fine indentations, nearly imperceptible. He withdrew a folded chart from the inner pocket of his coat. Naval semaphore, a language of flags and positions. But here, Edward used the geometry of grip and carving to spell a message. I followed as he traced the symbols. House, I read aloud. And this one, 1877. The year of his disgrace, Holmes said quietly, and the word that symbolized both his loss and the place where it occurred. He picked up the second umbrella. Others bore similar messages. Ivy, ivory, and once even Ned. Each tied to fragments of the man he had been, the woman who had loved him, the pipe he had smoked, the name they had taken from him. Why not write a letter? I asked. Holmes shook his head. Because words lie too easily. Edward chose symbols, unchanging, mute and precise. He spoke in silence, trusting his brother to remember the code they once shared. And did he? I asked. In the end, Holmes replied, I believe he did. He sat again, his gaze distant. These were not clues to a crime, Watson. They were fragments of a man's identity, sent adrift like messages in bottles, hoping to wash up on familiar shores. And as he spoke, I found myself struck not by the puzzle's cleverness, but by its sorrow. Edward Channing, Holmes continued, did not break into homes for gain. His acts were not opportunistic. They were scripted. He reached for his violin but did not play. Instead, he held it absently, as if its quiet presence aided his thinking. He returned to scenes from his former life, not as a fugitive, but as a performer. Each location chosen with care, each object removed or left behind with symbolic resonance. These were not robberies, but reenactments. He gestured toward the umbrella again. This was his stage prop, the portrait, his exit line. Each home a theatre, each night a scene. But to what end? I asked. Surely he knew the law would catch him. Obsession, Holmes said simply. A man exiled by disgrace, silenced by family, presumed dead. And in that silence, a mind begins to remake the world, not in truth, but in longing. He did not seek justice. He sought redress, to rewrite, to re-enter. Holmes paused, then added in a lower tone, to be witnessed. I sat in stillness, reflecting on the image of Edward Channing, walking alone through familiar streets, planting signs in the language of a past only he remembered. He was not a threat, Watson, Holmes said. He was a shadow searching for the light that once named him real. Holmes stood again and walked slowly to the window, pipe extinguished, violin untouched. Outside, the fog lay pressed against the glass like breath upon a mirror. There is a curious thing about the past, he said, not turning. One would think it's silent, distant, closed, but it is never that. He paused. The past, Watson, has claws. I said nothing, sensing he was not merely concluding the case, but speaking from some deeper register. It waits, he continued, beneath words unspoken and memories denied. We bury it in portraits, in attics, in old naval coats, only to find it clawing its way back when the silence grows too wide to hold. He turned toward me, and there was in his gaze a strange stillness, neither sorrow nor fatigue, but a kind of reverence. Edward Channing's actions were not the symptoms of madness. They were the logic of the wounded. A man may forget facts, Watson, but he does not forget being forgotten. I let those words settle. And you? I asked finally. Have you forgotten nothing? Holmes gave the barest smile. Everything I forget, he said, reminds me. That is its trick. He returned to his chair, the firelight dancing across his face. And in that quiet, I knew the case was finished. But its echoes, like the steps of a brother long returned, would linger in the margins of our minds. The hour had grown late by the time Holmes and I returned from our final conversation with Lestrade, and a fine drizzle had begun to fall over Baker Street. The gas lamps hissed gently beneath their glass domes, and the wet cobblestones gleamed like dark silk beneath their light. Inside, the room was quiet. The fire, now low in the grate, pulsed with a soft amber glow. I stirred it briefly, then settled into my usual chair. Holmes, his lean form wrapped in his dressing gown, sat in his armchair opposite me, his eyes fixed on some invisible point far beyond the walls of our rooms. He had not spoken since our return, save to request a match for his pipe. Now, he held it unlit between his fingers, as though the very act of smoking might distract him from the thread of thought he followed inwardly. The rain traced soft patterns against the window panes. It was a gentle sound, neither mournful nor soothing, but suggestive somehow of things left unresolved. I watched him in silence, the fire's light flickering across the planes of his face. There are moments when even Holmes seemed less a machine of intellect, and more a man watching the world from just behind its veil. After some time had passed, Holmes stirred at last. He did not look at me, but kept his gaze upon the rain-beaded glass. "There are minds," he said quietly, "that do not yield to peace." I said nothing, sensing the gravity of his tone. Edward Channing possessed brilliance, perhaps not of the analytical sort, but of recollection, of detail, of attachment. Such minds, when untempered by structure, become their own labyrinths. He did not merely remember, Watson, he relived. He turned slightly, the pipe now forgotten in his hand. To know one's life has been reduced to a scandal, to be struck from the ledger and spoken of only in hush or myth. It hollows a man. But to be remembered wrongly, that is a cruelty of a different kind. You believe it broke him? Holmes considered. Number one, believe it bent him, slowly, methodically, and with such precision that he believed the bending was his own design. He rose then and began to pace slowly, as was his custom in such reflective moods. It is a tragedy of the gifted, Watson, that without purpose they do not rest. They calcify. Memories become rituals, pain becomes theatre, and brilliance becomes a mirror turned inward. He paused and looked at me. There is no cure for that. Only mercy. And then he returned to his chair, the pipe untouched, his eyes still holding that distant glint, not of deduction, but of something far older and harder to name. It was rare for Holmes to speak in such terms, and rarer still for him to linger in their aftermath. I sensed he had not finished, and so I waited. After a moment, he resumed, his voice more subdued, yet no less certain. "We spend our days uncovering truths," he said, "facts, patterns, motives, each piece fitted into its proper place. But there are puzzles that resist being solved because they are not born of logic." He glanced toward the fire. Edward's acts were irrational. Yes, but they were also inevitable. You cannot reason a man out of a life he was never reasoned into. I nodded slowly. "And yet you caught him." "No," Holmes said. "He caught himself. We merely provided the mirror." He leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face. "I have read thousands of pages of testimony. I have heard confessions from lips that trembled and lips that smiled, but the wounds I cannot bind are the ones never spoken aloud, the guilt worn like a second skin, the shame folded into silence." He turned to me then. "You see, Watson, deduction reveals what happened, but it cannot tell us what it meant to the man who lived it." There was a long pause between us. "And so," he said finally, "we close another file. But not every story belongs in a ledger. Some belong only in the quiet space left behind." And with that, he leaned back once more, the case behind us, yet somehow still present. Holmes rose and crossed to his desk, where the case file on the Channing affair lay open, its final page still blank. He stood for a moment, pen in hand, then wrote a single line before gently closing the folder and tying the ribbon that bound it. I do not know what he wrote. I did not ask. Instead, I watched as he struck a match, and for the first time that evening, lit his pipe. The flame flared briefly, then dimmed into the steady glow of ember and smoke. He exhaled slowly and returned to his chair. The case, it seemed, had been filed away in name, but not forgotten in spirit. He glanced at the umbrella still propped in the corner, a relic now, but once a cipher. "You've often said, Watson," he murmured, "that every case begins with a question. But this one ends with one." I raised an eyebrow. "And what question is that?" Holmes's gaze did not leave the umbrella. "What becomes of a man when he is remembered by everything but his name?" He said no more, and I, knowing the limits of comfort in such moments, offered none. Only silence and the sound of the rain returning softly to the glass. In the days that followed, the world resumed its familiar pace. Carriages hummed through London's thoroughfares, telegrams clattered in offices, and the fog returned to its habitual vigil along the Thames. Yet within me lingered a stillness, not born of shock, but of reflection. As I sat once more in my armchair, pen in hand, it struck me how much of life escapes the judgment of courts and the ink of newspapers. The public will never know Edward Channing beyond the shallow headline, "Navy man found alive, sent to sanatorium." But I will remember him differently, not as a criminal, but as a wounded man walking a map etched in memory, searching for a version of himself that had long since been exiled. Holmes once told me that coats may change, but the wounds beneath them rarely do. And so, this case will not close with triumph or praise, but with a note of human sorrow. For in the quiet spaces of the mind, where shame whispers and love lingers, we are all, in some way, haunted. And as I set down the final line of this account, the umbrella still rests in the corner of our rooms, not as a clue, nor as a relic, but as a reminder. As the rain softened against the windows of Baker Street, Holmes sat with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed in thought. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "we are often called upon to solve crimes, but now and then we stumble upon something more elusive." "What was this then?" I asked. "A crime of memory?" "Precisely," he replied. "Not all ghosts wear sheets, nor do they moan in the night. Some knock politely, some leave behind umbrellas, but always they return, not to haunt, but to be acknowledged." He tapped the closed case file gently. "We may solve the facts, Watson, but we rarely solve the heart." What do you think was the true turning point? Was it the moment Edward left behind the first umbrella, or the moment his brother finally recognized it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes stories, and share this case with those who appreciate a mystery that lingers in both the mind and the soul.